Afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call to order Committee of the Whole number 214 for Tuesday, April 13th. And in honor of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Village of Pemberton acknowledges that we are meeting within the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. This meeting of council is being held virtually with all meeting participants attending via electronic communications to adhere to the PHO orders respecting physical distancing. Council members will be involved in and participate in the meeting virtually as they would in person. For those members of the public in attendance, please note that this meeting is a live webinar and is being recorded. A recording of the meeting will be available on the village's website following the meeting. Council members attending the meeting are required to verbally advise the chair of when they leave the meeting and return to the meeting so that this can be recorded in the minutes. For clarity, if a council member does not verbally advise the chair but is observed to be absent from their video feed for an extended period, and it is unclear to staff whether they are present in the meeting, the council member will be marked absent. Okay, with that, can I please are there any amendments to the agenda? Seeing none, a motion to approve the agenda. Councillor Noble, seconded by Councillor Craddock. Any opposed? Motion carries. Looks like you're on a bit of a delay again, Councillor Antonelli, so just on the pause, just when you put your hand up there. So if I'm missing you again, let me know. Adoption of minutes from Committee of the Whole number 213 from March 16th, moved by
Councillor Zab.
Seconded by Councillor Noble. Any opposed? Motion carries. And that takes us right into the main event for Committee of the Whole. So we're going to wait till our attendees join us.
Okay, I am just promoting them to panelists now. Okay, just waiting one more.
Are there two more joining us or one more? There we go. So perfect. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. We are about to look at or get an update on the work being done on the strategic priority of council to develop a community climate action plan. So Ms. Pedrini has joined us, and we also have Alison Jenkins and Maya Chorobik. Did I do that right? Excellent. Who are going to join us and take us through the update. So thank you so much for joining us. And if you guys are ready, I'll pass it over to all of you.
Mayor and Council, I'm just going at the village. So if I'm free, are all freezing now?
You are definitely freezing up.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably Ms. Pedrini was going to pass it over to Maya and Allison. And maybe we can just go from there. And if the Wi-Fi gets better, then Ms. Pedrini can jump back in.
Go ahead, Councillor Antonelli, before we begin.
Oh, I was just going to say that oftentimes if I turn off the video and just have the sound, it works better for me. So if anyone wants to try that, might be an idea.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alison Jenkins. I'm with the Community Energy Association, and my co-worker Maya Chorobik is also on the call. So I think Lisa was going to give a little introduction first, but perhaps I'll just jump right into the presentation if that works well for everyone. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, is everybody able to see my my PowerPoint here? Yeah. Okay. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide Council with an overview of the Community Climate Action Plan process and engagement results, answer questions and discuss next steps for finalising and implementing the plan. So we'll begin today by discussing what is a Community Climate Action Plan, the vision of the future as envisaged by the stakeholders, where we're at today, currently in Pemberton. We'll talk about setting an emissions reduction goal, we'll introduce you to the big moves and how the plan can be successfully implemented. And throughout this, I'll talk to how the stakeholders and the public were engaged in this process. So let's by looking at what is a community climate action plan. What is it and what isn't it? So when we talk about climate action, we're generally talking about two things: climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And it's important to make a distinction between the two. Climate change mitigation is the process of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whereas climate change adaptation is acknowledging that our climate is changing and look at ways that we can adapt to that changing climate. This plan looks at climate change mitigation. And when we're looking at our greenhouse gas emissions, we need to distinguish between territorial emissions and consumptive emissions. So our territorial emissions are those emissions that are produced locally within the community of Pemberton from its buildings, from transportation, and from waste. Consumptive emissions incorporate things like emissions from the food that you eat, the electronics that you purchase, clothes that you buy, and flights that you may take. So local governments have a high degree of influence over their territorial emissions, but low influence over consumptive emissions. So this Community Climate Action Plan focuses on territorial emissions from buildings, transportation, and waste. And we can also make a distinction between community and corporate emissions. So corporate emissions are those from your corporate assets, for example, emissions from City Hall, from snow clearing, from recreation centres, and so on. Whereas community emissions do incorporate those corporate emissions, but they are the emissions from all buildings within the community, residential buildings, community buildings, any industrial buildings, and your community residential vehicles, and so on. So corporate emissions typically account for 2 to 3% of community emissions, and this plan focuses on community emissions. So to summarize the CCAP process, the Community Climate Action Plan process, we began by looking at the greenhouse gas inventory for the village of Pemberton for buildings, transportation, and waste, and that data is available from the province. And that data is available from 2007 up to currently the most recent year is 2018. And then we modeled what we call the business as usual forecast to the year 2050. And what that is if the village of Pemberton doesn't implement any specific climate actions, what we think the greenhouse gas emissions will do over the next 30 years. We then, with the assistance of staff from the village, we came up with a list of stakeholders within the community, and they were engaged through 2 half-day workshops to get their input on this the process, defining the future vision of a low carbon vision of the future for Pemberton, and prioritizing strategies to get there. Just last week, Let's Talk Climate Action Pemberton, the public open house was hosted last week, and there's currently a survey open right now for the public to provide input on this process. So coming up, we will draft a community climate action plan, which will be then handed over to Village of Pemberton staff for input before coming up with the final plan that will be presented to council. So in the first of the 2 stakeholder workshops, we used a backcasting process. Backcasting is a planning approach that starts by defining the future vision before working backwards to identify and prioritize creative solutions to reach that desired future. So our stakeholders broke into 4 different groups. 2 were looking at buildings, new and existing buildings, 1 looking at transportation, and 1 looking at waste. We used, this all happened remotely. We used an interactive online whiteboard called Miro, and that's a screen grab of one of the boards that we used for the transportation group when they were envisaging their vision of Pemberton in the year 2040. So just to give you a little summary from each of the three broad categories: buildings, transportation, and waste, the vision of the low carbon future from the stakeholders. For buildings, the vision in the future was beautiful, affordable, and livable homes that are healthy and comfortable and fit for purpose, where propane heating has been replaced with low carbon heating, that all new buildings use electric heating, there's a sustainable urban core that is walkable and dense, and that new buildings use renewable resources. The vision for the future for transportation was that active transportation plays a large role. So that's walking, cycling, for example, a reduced need for vehicle ownership, an increased accessibility to transit, electric buses, no individually owned vehicles, and more carpooling whilst traveling to Whistler. And the vision for the future from the stakeholders for waste was zero waste, eliminating food waste, using local compost for local food, more focus on local and regionally produced food, single-use plastics are banned, extracting energy from waste, and Pemberton as a beacon for sustainability. We then asked stakeholders to describe the current state. So what is Pemberton like right now in those three categories: buildings, transportation, and waste? And again, this is just a screen grab from the Miro board for the transportation group. And here I've summarized the descriptions of the current state. So the buildings group actually felt that overall there's a pretty good, the buildings are pretty good, residential buildings are pretty good in Pemberton. They acknowledge that there are a lot of new homes being constructed, but some of the older homes do still use propane, and that there's a fairly dense urban core. For transportation, the stakeholders identified that there's a large commuter population and that there's a heavy truck culture. Minimal public transportation, just the bus going to Whistler, just very limited, couple buses in the morning, couple buses in the evening. But there is a very walkable downtown core, and that there is already a couple electric vehicle charging stations in place. Our stakeholders felt that currently there's a lot of food waste and that lots of waste is sent to landfill, but it was acknowledged that waste is managed by the regional district. So getting into the numbers, these are Pemberton's current greenhouse gas emissions, coming from the 2018 is the last complete inventory year from the data that we get from the province. So we've broken it down here into these 5 sectors. We have passenger vehicles, commercial vehicles, residential buildings. CSMI is commercial and small medium industrial buildings, and waste. So each one of those, there's 3 lines on the bar chart. So the blue one is your gigajoules, that's the amount of energy that's used. The purple is your tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and the green is the money spent on that energy. So we can see that passenger vehicles are by far the biggest source of your greenhouse gas emissions. And particularly if you combine those with commercial vehicles, you'll find that about 85 to 90% of Pemberton's greenhouse gas emissions come from vehicles. Pemberton's emissions from residential buildings are relatively low, largely because there isn't natural gas supplied. So a lot of your buildings are using electricity as their main fuel source for heating. There are some older ones that are still using propane or heating oil, but generally your buildings are have lower greenhouse gas emissions compared to other communities. Very low from commercial, small, medium industrial, and a small amount of emissions from waste. Looking at the amount of money that gets spent on energy, and I think this can often be a really motivating factor to reduce emissions, is simply the amount of money that gets spent on energy. So we can see that 71% of money that's spent on energy in Pemberton is spent on mobility fuels. So as a community as a whole, Pemberton residents and businesses spend just shy of $15 million on energy in 2018, but 71% of that was spent at the gas station, pretty much, filling up. And this is money that predominantly leaves the community. Just over $3 million is spent on electricity and just in the hundreds of thousands of dollars on wood and heating oil and propane. Now, I'll take a minute or two to explain this next graph. This is your, we call your business as usual chart. So the data from 2007 to 2018 is measured data, that is your inventory. And from 2019 to 2050, that is a modeled projection. And it takes into consideration population growth. It takes into consideration a changing climate. So a changing need for heating and cooling in future years. And it takes into consideration provincial and federal legislation that's coming into effect. So what we have here is essentially 5 charts stacked on top of one another. So at the bottom you have your emissions from waste. Then in pink, a very thin sliver of emissions from the commercial and industrial buildings. On top of that, emissions from residential buildings, then commercial vehicles and passenger vehicles. So you'll notice that even in this business as usual case, we do expect after about 2021, 2022 for greenhouse gas emissions start to reduce. And that's largely because of the Zero Emissions Vehicles Act, where the province of BC is requiring that every year an increasing percentage of new vehicle sales are zero emissions vehicles, or essentially electric vehicles. So even under a business as usual forecast, if the Village of Pemberton doesn't implement further climate action, we will expect to see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, predominantly from passenger vehicles. Less so in the short to medium term from commercial vehicles. As we know, they're slightly more challenging to switch over than just passenger vehicles. The other thing that is on this chart is a red line. Now this is what we've put in as your target line, your greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. Most communities in BC base their targets on 2007, and so that's what we've done here. And in line with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they have recommended that all communities reach essentially net zero by the year 2050. So that's that red line plotting from 2007 to net zero at 2050. Now, the plan that we're creating focuses primarily on actions to the year 2030, things that can be implemented in the next 5 to 10 years. And what you'll see is this chart shows that under a business as usual scenario, if Pemberton doesn't implement any additional climate actions, despite the reductions that you'll see in passenger vehicles from the provincial act, the Village of Pemberton wouldn't meet its 2030 target if it chooses to adopt a target in line with IPCC. But we're going to show that through the recommended actions in the plan, it will be possible to reach that. Before I move on to the next slide, does anyone have any questions to this point so far? Or I can take questions at the end.
I have a number of questions, but I think we'll probably end up answering them. So I think maybe just keep going for now, if that's all right.
Okay, no problem. I'm happy to, if anyone wants to interrupt to clarify, just let me know.
100%.
So I think at this point it's helpful to know what your neighbours are doing, because there's definitely going to be a lot of success through regional collaboration. So the District of Squamish, they published their Community Climate Action Plan in April 2020. And just a little quote from their plan: in 2030, emissions in the District of Squamish will be reduced by at least 45% from 2010 levels, and will be on track to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The resort municipality of Whistler created their Community Emissions and Climate Action Plan in 2016, but in 2020 they sort of revised a little bit with a 2020 Climate Action Big Move strategy. And so the new target commits Whistler to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% below 2007 levels by 2030. So local governments really have 3 things in their toolbox to help them reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Infrastructure, so things like building cycle paths, public electric vehicle charging stations, policy and regulations such as adopting the Energy Step Code, and then collaborating with community groups and nonprofits and engaging the public and businesses. And so a lot of the strategies and actions that we're going to recommend fall into one of those three categories, or sometimes they're in two of those categories.
So Alison, for example, where would regional transit fall into? Would that be infrastructure?
Yeah, infrastructure, but there may also be some community engagement on that as well, I would say, because, you know, what are the needs? How's that going to be most useful for residents and businesses? But yes, infrastructure, but also engagement and collaboration.
And just to add in there too, collaboration specifically with BC Transit, with the transit provider.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. So here I'd like to introduce the big moves. So these are the kind of broad categories in which the actions and strategies will fall into. And these are the things to really focus on to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in Pemberton. So transportation, buildings and waste. So we have three big moves in transportation. The first one being shift beyond the car. So the idea here is making it possible for residents of Pemberton to choose to not drive their car. So that's walking, cycling, and taking transit. And I know that the Village of Pemberton did a cycle plan. I think it was in 2020. So yeah, a really great starting point there. The second big move, and this is going to be a really key one for the Village of Pemberton, seeing that 85 to 90% of emissions come from vehicles, is electrifying passenger transportation. So enabling residents to make the switch to an electric vehicle when they are ready and able to do so. So we want to make sure that there are no barriers for people to making that switch to electric vehicles. So that means making sure there's a really robust electric vehicle charging network. So locally within Pemberton, but also within the region, collaborating with your neighbours. And also making it, ensuring that all new buildings, residential and commercial, are built with EV charging infrastructure. And working with the stratas and property managers of the condos and townhouses of the existing buildings to make sure that residents have the ability to put in charging infrastructure in the townhouses and condos that already exist. Decarbonising commercial transportation is the more challenging one at this point in time, and we expect, so it is featured in the plan, but to a lesser degree. We expect to see just smaller reductions in this in the short to medium term, but we hope to see more reductions in this in the longer term through decarbonisation, whether that's through electrifying or just other fuels with a lower carbon content. But there are lots of things happening within the provincial government, incentives and rebates for businesses to invest in lower carbon commercial transportation. So in terms of buildings, really great to hear that Pemberton has already adopted step 4 of the Energy Step Code. That's really fantastic and demonstrating leadership in the province, especially as there's so much new construction happening in Pemberton. That's really wonderful that you've already adopted step 4. So all new buildings 40% more energy efficient than 2018 building code. Of course, there is one step higher than that, step 5, which will require buildings to be 80% more efficient. Currently, the step code doesn't have any greenhouse gas emission component to it. It requires buildings to be more energy efficient, but it doesn't stipulate that the energy consumption is low carbon. This is something that is being talked about and maybe coming in the next couple of years, actually requiring kind of a similar steps requiring lower greenhouse gas emissions for buildings. Now in Pemberton, you don't have natural gas, so this is probably less of an issue than in other communities. But if someone were to build a new building and use propane as their heating source, yes, it might be more energy efficient, but it's not the low carbon option. The low carbon option is to require, say, an air source heat pump. The challenging one is decarbonising existing buildings, but a lot of your buildings are already electric. I know there are some older buildings that are using propane, for example, or heating oil. So enabling residents to, perhaps when that furnace is reaching end of life, to replace it with an electric air source heat pump rather than another traditional furnace. And also helping to make buildings more energy efficient. More coming, I think, from the province in terms of rebates and financing to make your homes more energy efficient. And that's more money in people's pockets as well. And then the final big move is closing the loop on waste. So really focusing here on diverting organics from landfill. But this ties in quite a bit with food as well, which I know was something that a lot of our stakeholders were really passionate about. And whilst food is a little bit outside of the scope of the plan here, it does tie in with that idea of waste, diverting all organics from the landfill. And then it's great that we have the Sea to Sky organics to turn that into compost, which can then be used locally again for food. But there's other things we want to try and keep out from the landfill as well. If buildings, there's deconstruction of buildings, construction waste, trying to keep that out of landfill as much as possible. So what we did then with our stakeholders is we identified a number of strategies and actions within each of those big moves. And we asked our stakeholders to prioritize them. So high priority strategies, things that could be done in the next couple of years, medium priority, things to do in 3 to 5 years, and lower priority, which might be more of on a 5 to 10 year timescale. So again, this is just a screenshot from the Miro board. And in transportation, the two different colors. One color, the orange, is focusing more on the electrifying passenger vehicles, and the purple colors are more to do with switching to walking and cycling and active transportation. And we then asked our stakeholders to pick 1 or 2 of their high priority strategies and do a bit of a deeper dive, looking at co-benefits, what are the barriers and challenges, next steps, and so on. And so this is our similar wedge charts that we looked at earlier, but this is fully implementing the plan. Now, when we looked at this chart previously, we noticed that Pemberton would not reach its 2030 target without implementing any actions. But what these colored sections are, they're showing that's where we're carving away our greenhouse gas emissions. And so this chart is showing that actually by implementing these things, that by 2030, Pemberton could be on track for its 2030 target. We've broken the big moves down even a little bit further here. So for example, shift beyond the car, we've actually broken it down into active transportation, transit, and land use, although they do represent collectively a fairly small proportion of the potential greenhouse gas emissions. And we think that the biggest emissions will come from electrifying passenger vehicles. Now, this is going above and beyond what we think will happen anyway due to the provincially required Zero Emissions Vehicles Act. We think that communities that play a really proactive role in removing barriers and enabling their residents to make the switch to electrify can get faster and deeper emissions reductions from this action. And similarly with the existing buildings, we've broken it down into retrofits. So retrofitting your building, whether that's more insulation, replacing windows, but also fuel switching by replacing propane with heat pumps. We've broken those down into 2 as well. But essentially those are your big moves. So what this is showing is that Pemberton can be on track for that net zero target in 2030 by implementing this plan. What you will see is that when you start getting beyond about 2035, this plan, the emission savings from this plan do start to plateau off, and there is a gap left in 2050 between where we think Pemberton's GHG emissions will be and that net zero. Now, we're not really concerned about that at this time because that's a really long way in the future, and it's really important to focus on what we can do in the next 5 to 10 years. What we do know is that there's going to be a lot of big technological advancements from 2030, 2040 onwards. When we think about how much electric vehicles, how far they've come in the last 10 years, the cost reductions in solar panels in the last 10 years. So we've seen so much technological change in the last 10 years. We have every reason to believe there will be again in the next 10 years and the 10 years after that. So we recommend that communities revisit this plan every 5 to 10 years. And at that point, we will likely see that gap that's currently showing at 2050 to be reduced. There'll also probably be other things we could look at in terms of carbon sequestration. And that's something that's being looked into more and more at this point in time. So implementing this plan is obviously really, really key. It's one thing to have the plan, but it has to be implemented for it to be successful. So these are some of the things that you can do to make it a really successful plan. So incorporating the targets and the actions from the Community Climate Action Plan into other planning documents. So solid waste plans, strategic plans, transportation plans, incorporating climate action into the budgeting process. Monitoring is really, really key. So monitoring your actual greenhouse gas emissions every year moving forward, but we can identify some other key performance indicators that may also show progress. Regularly convening a mayor's task force, a committee of council, and so on to discuss the implementation, reporting on a regular basis to council to keep accountable, and then renewing that plan every few years. So yeah, so today we've had this presentation to the Committee of the Whole, and we recently had the public open house. The public survey is live at the moment, and then we'll be taking this feedback on board, creating our draft report, which we'll be giving to staff to review, and then obviously at a future date we'll be presenting the plan to council to hopefully be adopted. Really great website you may already have seen or perhaps not is the BC Climate Leaders Playbook. That's a really great resource for learning more about the big moves. So I'm happy to take questions at this point, and my co-worker Maya will also probably be helping out to answer some of the questions as well. But I know, yeah, I think I'll open up for you guys to questions.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was a great presentation. As I said in the outset, that this is a strategic priority for council, to have this plan and look at implementation. So I think we all, I know I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited to see this get into play and move on. I'll open with one quick question and then open up for others as well. You know, you mentioned some of the targets for Whistler and Squamish, some of the plans they've put together. When you're building the next or the draft of this plan, when you're putting it together and you're considering action items, how do you consider what neighboring communities are doing, not only to draw from that, but also to align so that whether it's policies, you know, EV chargers, you know, up and down the corridor sort of thing, commercial transportation, for instance, we talked about commercial transportation. That's something that's, you know, I know the district discussion with the Lower Mainland mayors to talk about how they can have start looking electrifying. So how does your plan consider and your actions consider what our neighbors are doing?
Yeah, as you said, I think really important to be on the same page. I mean, we've certainly looked at the Squamish and Whistler plans to see what they're doing, and with Whistler coming out with their 2020 big move strategy, their big moves are actually very much based on the big moves from the Climate Leaders Playbook, which is the website that I just referenced, which is something that we've put out there. So, and the District of Squamish plan being so new, everything is very much aligned. We're all on the same page in terms of the plan and the targets and the big moves. And I think there's a lot of collaboration already happening. I mean, I know that there was a proposal put in just a few months ago for regional electric vehicle charging stations for the Sea to Sky, Squamish, Whistler, Pemberton, and Lillooet Nation. So I think that's a really great example. We're also working right now with Whistler and Squamish and New Westminster on a heat pump pilot project. Is another kind of project that we're implementing with them right now. So yes, I'm not really sure if I'm really answering your question here, but what Squamish and Whistler have in their plans is very much kind of in line with this big moves concept that we're proposing here.
Yeah, I know
They're focusing on the same things.
Yeah, I realize that, and that's why I wonder when I was thinking a little bit more in terms of the granular details, like some of the policy alignment. I know there's been discussion up and down the corridor, who's on step 4, who's adopting, what's the targets for that. And considering that, for instance, tradesmen and contractors work up and down the corridor, aligning those goals, aligning our goals for having, removing barriers like providing more EV chargers and all those sorts of things. I think that collaboration is really key. So I'm sure it's considered. Those are sort of the specifics I look forward to hearing how we can build upon and connect with, and not mirror necessarily, but connect with what our neighbors are doing.
Yeah.
So thanks.
One thing I might add to that, to this topic is something that you will find in the kind of organizational leadership or implementation for success sections of the plan, which is formalizing some of the structures of that collaboration. So whether that's via the regional district, task force, if you will, that meets regularly to advance regional issues on this. Metro Vancouver has such a committee, actually both at the elected and staff level. So that's something that as the communities in your region advance these initiatives, could be a great, very tactical, practical thing that they can do to make sure that happens and continues to happen on an ongoing basis. So that will be a recommendation to that effect in the plan.
Right. Thank you. I'll open up to questions from the committee. Do we still need the screen sharing, everybody, or?
Yeah, I could stop screen sharing if that's better.
Then I could see hands and faces. Perfect. Any questions? Go ahead, Councillor Antonelli. You're on mute.
Okay, there we go. Is there a way to make the comparison between communities easier? So I always find that, 50% reduction by this year based on that year, it doesn't actually contain a lot of information for me, other than I know we're all trying to reduce it. It'd be really helpful if we had a, annual per capita that we could compare to past years and track our change over time. And it's the same problem with all the international protocols. It's really hard to tell exactly what they're talking about and measure any kind of progress. So if we could include something like that in there, I mean, these may be calculations that are beyond us, but yeah, it would be really helpful to have a more meaningful measure.
Yeah, that's really great feedback. Yes, Squamish, District of Squamish are quoting 2010 levels in their target, and yeah, the resort municipality of Whistler are quoting 2007 in their target. So most communities refer back to 2007. And yes, some communities are looking at things per capita, whereas Squamish and Whistler, as far as I'm aware, are not looking at it per capita. Some are. They're just looking at complete greenhouse gas emissions reductions.
Yeah, and even if your target is on the total greenhouse gas reduction target, using per capita emissions as one of the indicators just to track the progress could be very useful. So that's just a way to account for the growth that Pemberton might see in the future with new residents. Of course, what really matters is the total emissions, but in terms of really understanding how fast or slow progress is happening on the emissions reductions, including that per capita number in the tracking is a good idea. So we'll be providing a list of suggested key performance indicators. That will be just one of them, but certain other things that are highly easier to measure and visualize, such as number of EVs in the community, that kind of thing that could a little more tangible ways to track progress in addition to the total emissions reductions.
Any questions? I'm not entirely surprised, but a little bit shocked by the number, the percent. Did you say it was between commercial and passenger? It was 85 or 95?
Between 85 and
Was it
90 if
85?
you combine passenger and commercial transportation. And the reason it's such a high percentage is because emissions from buildings are quite low for the village of Pemberton compared to comparable communities, because you aren't supplied with natural gas. So it's kind of a good thing from a buildings perspective, but it really means that the bulk of your emissions are from transportation. And obviously there's a lot of commuting between Pemberton and Whistler. So yeah, that really is where most of your emissions are coming from.
Well, it certainly helps focus the efforts. You know, like you said, we're already adopting step 4 of the building code. We're moving in those directions. You know, active transportation is something we consider for sure, and we'll continue. Connectivity, walkability, and trails, all that. And as you know, up and down the corridor, we're trying to get a regional transit system into play. But to me, the fact that it's 85 to 90% of our emissions come from vehicles just really shows where we need to focus our attentions and our actions. And I think it's just a really good stat for people to know. We all, you know, many people may or may not have a second thought when they're filling at the pump or deciding whether to carpool that day, although carpooling is not much of a thing these days. But knowing that number, I think that's really important for the public to know. Any other questions or comments? So anxious to see, I'm sure that within the plan, there'll be short-term, mid-term, long-term sort of action items for us to consider, as you laid out a little bit already. What kind of timeline, when can council expect to see further drafts of this? Or when do you present it to staff?
Yeah, so the public survey just went live last week. I believe that's open for about 3 or 4 weeks. So once that's finished, then we'll be able to get the results, get that input from the members of the public from Pemberton. So probably within just a few weeks after that, we'll be able to get a draft report to staff. Yeah.
Awesome. Nikki, I don't know if Lisa's or Sheena, if Lisa's around or still able. I don't know if she wants to put anything in before we close it out. You are around. Hi, Lisa. Did you want to add anything before we wrap things up? Or are you able to? No. Okay. Well, if there's no further questions or comments from council, thank you to both of you. I'm very excited about this work.
That can add much.
Okay, don't try. Again, thanks to both of you, and really looking forward to seeing the next draft. Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you to Mayor and Council for your questions. Appreciate it.
So wait for our guests to leave, and that is it for Committee of the Whole. That's again, that's exciting. I'm really glad to see that progress report. So a motion to adjourn Committee of the Whole, but before we leave the meeting, we can't start until 3:30, right, Sheena? Because we have to open the regular. You're on mute.
Yep, my apologies. Yes.
Okay. So I'll look for motion to adjourn, and then we'll come back to this Zoom link for 3:30.
Motion to adjourn. Councilor Zappa.
Second, Councilor Noble, any opposed? We're adjourned.